Picture this: a self-appointed HOA vigilante, a century-old oak, and a twist of fate that left her house in ruins. Ready for the unbelievable story? I never imagined that the quiet suburban life I'd worked so hard to build could turn into a real-life drama starring an entitled neighbor and a majestic oak tree. But life, as it often does, had its own plans. I live in a neighborhood where everyone knows everyone, or at least, we pretend we do. For years, my yard, with its sprawling front lawn and the ancient oak tree standing proudly at the center, was my sanctuary. That oak wasn't just any tree, it was a living monument, planted by my grandfather decades ago. I took immense pride in it, not only for its beauty and history, but also for the shady comfort it provided during sweltering summers. Enter Karen. From the moment Karen moved into the house next door, it was clear she wasn't like the rest of us. She wasn't content with quietly tending to her garden or exchanging polite hellos over the fence. Instead, she made it her mission to enforce every little rule of the neighborhood, often inventing new ones along the way. I'd heard whispers among the neighbors. She'd filed complaints for having a mailbox that was unsightly, and even for leaving her recycling bins out too long. To Karen, it seemed, perfection was the only acceptable standard. I had almost forgotten about her until one fateful Tuesday morning in early spring. I was deep into a Zoom call with a client, a critical presentation that demanded my full attention, when an unusual buzzing sound disrupted my concentration. At first, I dismissed it as the hum of my air conditioner. But as the sound grew louder, I realized it was coming from my backyard. Curiosity, and a growing sense of dread, led me to excuse myself from the call. When I stepped outside, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There, in the middle of my meticulously kept lawn, stood Karen. In her hands, a chainsaw. I froze. My beloved oak, with its gnarled trunk and sprawling branches, had a fresh, shallow cut, barely an inch deep, but the implications were huge. Karen was trying to cut it down. "Excuse me," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady despite the shock. "What on earth are you doing on my property?" She looked up, chainsaw paused midway, and smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, good morning. I'm just taking care of a tree situation," she replied breezily, gesturing vaguely at the oak as if it were an eyesore. "A tree situation?" I echoed incredulously. "This tree is a part of my family's history. It's on my property, and you have no right to be here." Karen's smile wavered for a split second before she launched into her usual spiel. "Well, according to our HOA guidelines, any tree over 35 feet is a hazard. And this one is clearly a problem." She waved the chainsaw as if it were a badge of authority. I knew my tree was over 35 feet tall, and a landmark at that, but I also knew that no such bylaw existed. "Karen, you're mistaken," I said firmly. "I've read the HOA handbook cover to cover. There's no rule that says anything about tree height, and even if there were, you're not here to enforce it. You're trespassing." Her eyes flashed with indignation. "I'm just doing my duty to keep this neighborhood safe," she insisted, though her tone now carried a hint of desperation. That was the moment I realized things were spiraling out of control. I calmly told her to leave my yard immediately, warning that I would call the police if she didn't. For a few tense moments, she just stared, chainsaw still in hand. Then, almost as if acknowledging defeat, she switched off the tool and stormed off with a huff, leaving me both relieved and unsettled. Later that day, I learned that Karen had sent me an official-looking violation notice. It cited a rule about tree heights, a rule that, as I later confirmed with the actual HOA board, didn't even exist. The real HOA president called me later to assure me that Karen's actions were unauthorized and that the notice was invalid. It turned out that Karen was not even an official board member. She was simply someone who had taken it upon herself to police the neighborhood. Determined to protect my property and my tree, I sought advice from a close friend who happens to be a lawyer specializing in property disputes. He advised me to document everything, set up security cameras, and report the incident to the police. I did all that, and sure enough, the local officers took my statement and promised to follow up with Karen. I thought the worst was over. But as fate would have it, karma had another twist in store. A few days after the incident, the weather took a dramatic turn. A powerful storm rolled in one afternoon, complete with howling winds and torrential rain. I sat by my window, watching the tempest with a mix of awe and anxiety, my thoughts intermittently drifting to my damaged oak. Remarkably, the storm did little harm to my tree. It stood firm, its mighty branches bending gracefully in the wind. Across the street, however, chaos was unfolding. I noticed a commotion at Karen's house, neighbors gathered, murmuring in concern. Curious, I drove over to see what was happening. When I arrived, the scene was something out of a movie. A long-dead pine tree from her front yard had finally given way to the elements and crashed down right onto her roof. The impact was severe. Shingles were missing, water was pouring in, and it was clear that repairs would be costly. As I pulled up, Karen emerged, drenched by the rain and visibly distraught. Instead of acknowledging the irony of the situation, she began shouting at anyone within earshot, blaming me for her misfortune. "It's all your fault," she screamed, pointing at me as if I'd somehow orchestrated the falling tree. "You and your tree have cursed this neighborhood." I stood there, speechless. How could someone so fixated on enforcing rules not even their own be so blind to the obvious truth? My neighbors exchanged bewildered glances, and soon, a small circle of witnesses formed. One elderly man, who had witnessed the earlier incident, remarked, "I always thought she was a bit too intense, but this takes the cake." Before things could escalate further, an officer arrived on the scene. After a brief conversation, it became clear that Karen's claims were baseless. The officer advised her to focus on getting help for her damaged home rather than launching absurd accusations. Meanwhile, the actual HOA board issued a formal statement condemning her actions and clarified that she had no authority to enforce any rule. In the days that followed, the community buzzed with conversation about the dramatic turn of events. I received messages of support from neighbors who'd long been frustrated with Karen's overzealous behavior. The irony of her downfall, quite literally, became the talk of the town. Some even joked that nature itself had served up a long overdue dose of justice. A week later, I received a visit from Karen's ex-husband, who introduced himself as Richard. He explained that he'd been hearing about the incident and wanted to make amends. "I'm really sorry about what happened," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "I know Karen's been hard to deal with, and while she's made some questionable choices, I didn't expect things to go this far." He went on to offer a settlement to cover any damages I might have incurred as a result of the ordeal. Although I appreciated his gesture, I knew that the principle of the matter was more important than any monetary settlement. Legal proceedings followed swiftly. With the clear evidence from my security cameras, multiple witness accounts, and the invalid HOA notice in hand, the authorities had no choice but to press charges. Karen eventually accepted a plea deal that included significant fines and community service, a small consolation compared to the potential damage she could have caused. In the aftermath, as I stood in my yard surveying the scars on my beloved oak, I couldn't help but reflect on the strange series of events. My tree, despite the shallow cut from that fateful morning, had weathered the storm, both literally and figuratively. Neighbors, who once kept to themselves, began coming together, offering support, sharing stories, and even helping me care for the tree. What started as a personal battle quickly became a catalyst for a renewed sense of community. As spring turned to summer, I decided to honor the old oak by planting a sapling nearby, a living tribute to resilience, history, and the enduring spirit of our neighborhood. Every time I looked at the young tree, I was reminded that while people may try to enforce their version of order, nature has its own way of balancing the scales. And sometimes, the universe delivers justice in the most unexpected and humorous ways. So, if you ever find yourself facing an overzealous neighbor or a self-appointed rule enforcer, remember, while you can't control their actions, you can control your response. Stand up for what you believe in, protect what matters, and trust that, in the end, truth and nature will prevail.